Module 12, the SAP router installation. For this installation, the Terraform created a VM standard 2.1 with an IP address of 10.0.6.2 and no public-facing IP address. This instance was created without a graphical user interface, so all interaction with the environment needs to be done through an SSH terminal session. In order to accomplish this, I will create a VNC session from the Bastion server and SSH over via the terminal. I also created a load balancer configuration. This will allow connections from the internet to access the SAP router and be redirected to the SAP application server. Let's take a look on how I created the configuration for the load balancer. Utilizing the same load balancer that was created by Terraform, which currently has a critical health status. And the reason for that is because I have configured the load balancer to monitor for the SAP router, which has not yet been installed. As you can see, the load balancer is still using the same IP address of 129.146.153.230 on the public interface. There are two private subnets associated with this, which I'll refer to later on. Scrolling down, we go to the backend sets, and we can see that the web dispatcher is in status of OK, while the SAP router is in critical. If I look at the monitoring configuration, it is monitoring port 3299 via TCP. Clicking on the listeners, you can see that I've configured the listener to listen on port 3299 for TCP. Now let's go ahead and install the SAP router. Here you can see the VNC session with a terminal session opened that I'll begin to do the install from. The first step is to SSH over to the SAP router server. And I need to change to the SAP ADM user. Next, I will be changing into the directory user SAP router. As you can see, there are no files in the directory. I will now extract the contents of the SAP archive file that's located in the install files directory. 3 files were extracted. I also will need to copy over a configuration file that I've created already. This file is called the SAP route tab. This file is what's used to configure the SAP router to listen on particular ports. I will pull up the route tab file to show you the contents and the permissions that I've already established. The first set of permissions that I've granted are permitting access from the 10.0.1.0 subnet to the SAP application server 10.0.2.2. It is allowing traffic on ports 3600 and 3201. These are the ports that the ASCS listens on and the SAP Messenger server for the DEM environment. These 2 rules were set up for the internal use of the SAP router. I've created these other 4 rules to listen to connections that will be coming from the public interface of the load balancer. And I mentioned earlier that there were 2 private subnets that the load balancer connects to. That would be the 10.0.7.0 and 10.0.8.0 subnets. And I need to also allow the ASCS, and the message server connect to both of those. The last rule here denies all other traffic that is not permitted above. For a moment here, I will switch over to the SAP GUI and show you that I've created a connection to the SAP environment directly without using the SAP router. You can see that it's connecting to 10.0.2.2 and it found logon group, and here's that port 3600. When I initiate the connection, I am prompted for a logon, and you can see that it's actually the server it's connected to is SAP LNX APP, which is the IP, or which is the host name for the IP 10.0.2.0. Close out that session. I will now start the SAP router. The command to start the SAP router is simply SAProuter -r minus capital R to point to the route tab file. By default, it looks in the existing directory. I just, for this example, want to show that I am actually using that file that I showed you earlier, and an ampersand to run the process in the background. Once the SAProuter has started, we can go ahead and monitor the environment with the SAProuter -L. We see that we have no connections right now except from the local host, which is the SAP router running itself. You also see the directory that it's running from and the actual config file it's using. Back to the SAP GUI, you see that I've created a logon to the GUI using the private the private interface of the router, SAProuter. And it is connecting to 10.0.6.2, which is the SAP router. I've been able to establish a connection, and if I issue the monitoring command, you'll see that I have one session through the SAP router coming from the Bastion server. I now have one created where I'm using the public interface. So I'm actually sending the traffic out of the OCI and back in on the load balancer using the IP address of 129.146.153.230. I'm also able to get a connection to the SAP application server. And if we look at the monitor of the SAProut tab, you now see that I have a session that's been initiated from the 10.0.8.2, which is the private subnet that the load balancers are connected to from the public internet. That ends the SAP router installation video.